Remember, you've only got until the 17th of July to pledge to the Spacedock Officers Club at the level of Gravimetric Space Gentleman or higher if you want to get your hands on an exclusive Spacedock patch. The link can be found in the description below this marvellous video. Hey everybody, Daniel from Spacedock here, back with another top 5 video. This time we'll be doing top 5 frigates. I should clarify that this is dedicated standard issue frigates rather than things like stealth frigates or other subsidiaries, so don't expect the Normandy class or the Amon-Ra class. They've already had their moment in the sun from the stealth ships video. I'll be going through my 5 favourite ships in ascending order, and without further ado, let's get right into it. First up, in 5th place, it's the Imperial Lancer class frigate from mostly Star Wars Legends. This was always portrayed across the original X-Wing games and various other pieces of EU material as basically the ultimate anti-starfighter platform. It's just a mountain of quad laser cannons, and going anywhere near it in any kind of starfighter is suicide. It was a key feature of the X-Wing games. It made for the most challenging missions. It built the sort of terrain of the maps. You knew what you needed to avoid. Bombing runs against these things were horrific, as you had to fly through enormous flak fields or fields of point defense fire with your B-Wings and your Y-Wing squadrons. I was rather disappointed that this did not make it into the epic grade of Star Wars X-Wing miniatures, as I know that was the plan at one point, but at the same time I'm also very glad that happened, because the fact that they didn't use this ship as a result of its being too long caused them to design the Imperial Raider class, which is now featured in the game as a corvette and more prominently in Battlefront 2 and various other things, and that's a gorgeous ship, so I'm glad that happened. But at the same time, it is a little bit sad that we didn't get to see the Lancer class made into plastic and added to the board game. I'd love to see this back in more of a higher profile role at some point in Star Wars. Thankfully, the canon does confirm in Before the Awakening that the First Order are using these, so they are around in the new timeline, and perhaps we will see one at some point. But just to briefly rattle off the stats, this ship is 250 meters long. You can see why it was considered too large for the X-Wing miniatures game, and carries 20 point defense quad laser cannons distributed all around the ship and operated by 40 gunners accompanying a crew of 810. This fills a nice auxiliary role that pads out the Imperial fleet a bit, and while a lot of those old Imperial Legends designs were a little bit too crazy or just added too many designs to the Imperial fleet to make it succinct, this was one of the better ones, and I'd love to see it back in the canon at some point on screen. Next up, in 4th place, it's the Paris-class heavy frigates from Halo. Now, there are, I think, 3 varieties of UNSC frigate released in Halo. That's ships of this particular shape and frame. I'm not including the weird 343 redesigns. And this general shape overall of the Paris and the Charon and the Stalwart is one of the most iconic images that this IP has contributed to science fiction. This is an incredibly cool-looking ship. Like a lot of Halo's art style, it's inspired by Alien and Aliens, in this case the Sulaco, and it took that style of essentially being a giant flying rifle and extrapolated on it even further. Form follows function here. The ship is built around the mass accelerator cannon, but it's done so in a way that makes a really satisfying, stark and impressive frame that always looks fantastic on screen from any angle. I definitely think this is the best designed ship in the Halo property, and a real contender for one of the best looking frigates in science fiction. The ship is 535 meters long, which is quite substantial, armed of course with the magnetic accelerator cannon, but also 40 Archer missile pods and a number of point defense guns. The best look at this ship that we get in the games is the UNSC Savannah during the events of Halo Reach, where we get to see it in combat, fighting alongside a bunch of sabers and duking it out with the Ardent Prayer, a Covenant corvette. There are subtle differences between the Paris, Charon and Stalwart designs. Paris doesn't have the loading bay that we see the Forward Unto Dawn have in Halo 3. This appears to be more of a straightforward space combat design. I can't say enough good things about this ship. It looks great, it's got a wonderful presence on screen, it's given exactly as much spotlight in the games as it deserves, and it's sorely missed in the post-343, frankly slightly less inspired design realm that Halo now finds itself in. Next up we have the New Orleans-class frigate from Star Trek, and I'm continuing my tradition of giving praise to Star Trek's weird kit bash designs. This one probably is the most conventional-looking ship that resulted from the kit bashing, but it's a really awesome, unique little design, and I'm glad that it recently got some spotlight in Star Trek Online and stuff, and was kind of brought to the forefront a bit more, also by Eagle Moss. Obviously, as anyone who has analysed this ship in any detail can tell you, this ship is the result of basically gluing some highlighter pens to bits of a Galaxy-class model and rearranging some of the stuff around. The highlighter pens, as represented in the universe, are supposed to be forward and aft torpedo pods. This ship is meant to be a kind of Cardassian Wars emergency warship, as the Federation tripped over its pacifism for the 905th time and wound up having to build some defensive starships to keep everybody alive. In order to make this ship that's built out of Galaxy-class model components look smaller, as it's supposed to be a frigate, they basically just increase the size of the windows on the model and the nameplate. This does the job perfectly well. The ship does look smaller. I really wish we'd seen these flying alongside the Enterprise a few times in TNG. Every single time they needed a random ship for an admiral to arrive on, it was always an Excelsior class. I get that they might not have been overly willing to use their kit bashes since they had just been made with stuff that was lying around, but I think this was gorgeous. It was a really nice looking model, and it deserved to be given the spotlight no matter how cheaply it had come into existence. The ship is 425 meters long in canon with a crew of 550 officers. It can apparently reach warp 9.3 and maintain it for 6 hours, and even though its frame is quite small, it still has space for 10 Type 9 phaser emitters, as well as the 2 ventral and 1 dorsal multi-directional torpedo pods. An interesting piece of lore applied to this ship is that the USS Rutledge, the ship that Miles O'Brien served on during the Cardassian Wars, was New Orleans class. We've seen it rendered in comics, which is very nice. Aside from that, we've seen it wrecked at Wolf 359 and not much else. I feel like this ship has probably sailed. There's no chance of us seeing this again in modern Star Trek, very sadly, although it did get those well-deserved callbacks in Eaglemoss and Star Trek Online. Very thankful for that. A really smart and unique little ship, and a great addition to the 2360s kind of era of Star Trek lore. And in second place, here's one you should definitely have seen coming on this list. It's the Martian corvette-class light frigate, and yes, for the 500th time I will explain what the logic is behind that name. The moniker of corvette does not exist as we know it in the MCRN. They are not as traditional as the UNN, who do have ships of corvette type. However, in this particular instance, the MCRN wanted to design a ship that is based on the historical principle of a corvette, yet it is part of their frigate range. It is a light frigate. It's named after the historical class that its tactics emulate, corvette-class light frigate. Understandably confusing, but certainly built with some logic in mind. Now, overall, this is, I think, a fantastic adaptation of the book's description of the Rocinante, a flying chisel, as it was called, and yet it is also built in such a way as to make perfect sense in realistic space combat. Its PDC coverage is logical and near total, playing brilliantly into its style and movement in combat. The inlaid torpedo tubes are added to the frame without disturbing the flow of the design, and it works perfectly. The orientation of the doors give us that constant reminder of the orientation of the interior decks, as the Expanse loves to do, to remind us that it is playing by the rules. And the ship is built in that classic long, narrow, taut ship design with thought given to center of mass and sturdy long-distance travel. In its original MCRN paint job, it looks absolutely fantastic in the black and orange. I personally love the Rocinante's grey, personalized color scheme. It certainly works as an identity for that ship alone, but even while that's the case, the corvette class looks fantastic as part of a larger Martian fleet when we see it alongside the Donager and other vessels. I want to give a lot of respect to the Expanse show here for one very, very brief moment in Season 2 where we see the MCRN Karakum, which is also corvette class, and in doing that, the Expanse have defied the hero ship rule that Star Trek always played itself by, where they would never show another ship of the same class as the hero ship in case the audience gets confused, which is incredibly patronizing and assumes the audience are just dense. But the Expanse, in true Expanse fashion, has boundless respect for its audience and assumes that you can just keep track of what's going on. So we've seen one corvette-class ship other than the Rocinante, and I'm sure we'll see more in the future, and I'm excited for that when we do. The ship is 46 meters long. It is, of course, powered by an Epstein drive, carries 6 40mm Narrowman Dynamics point defense cannons, and 2 torpedo launchers. The ship is designed to carry 30 people, that's including the Marine complement, although, as we've seen extensively in the books and the show, it can be handily operated by 3 or 4 people without too much difficulty. This plays into the usual sophistication of MCRN designs, more expensive ships with more advanced technology, but fewer of them compared to the UNN. This is probably my second favourite MCRN design after the Morrigan class patrol destroyer, and that's because the Morrigan class is just the coolest looking thing I've ever seen, and I also got to name it and write all the lore for it in Force Recon, so it's always going to be an enormous bias for me when comparing Expanse ships, but I suspect there are a lot of people out there who prefer the Corvette class to the Morrigan, and I can certainly understand why. This is a ship that will go down in sci-fi history as one of the classic hero ships of modern science fiction. Fantastic work, can't wait to see more of it in Season 4. And last up in first place, it is the absolutely beautiful Adamant-class frigate from Battlestar Galactica Deadlock. This is the best looking ship in Deadlock. It's potentially the best looking ship in Battlestar Galactica, competing only, I think, with the Mercury-class Battlestar. And it is by far the best interpretation of an established properties art style by a new team I've ever seen. This is a colonial frigate. Nothing else could ever have matched this kind of design. The way they've managed to extrapolate from subtle elements of the Jupiter's design and various other parts of the main show to make this frame is just perfect. Not a single inch of space on this frame is wasted. It has the 8 broadside launch tubes and the awesome underslung retrieval bay, the arrays of Age of Sail style fixed guns along the top of either side, the Galactica style kind of curving engine assemblies, except held in far closer proximity than we see on the Galactica. Even the sort of nose clusters of sensors and DRADIS arrays kept out of harm's way by the sloping armor. This is just a wonderfully efficient and refined and brilliant ship design. Normally I don't go into too much detail about BTS design elements on Spacedock, but in this case I want to give a massive shout out to Anthony Carriero, who designed this ship. Go and follow him on Twitter, part of the Deadlock team. These guys had an incredible task given to them to be handed the keys to this amazing sci-fi property, and also handed the responsibility of living up to the expectations of the fans of that property. It would have been so easy to get it wrong, and to end up with a bunch of ships that didn't reflect the colonial design well, or that didn't expand upon the fleet in the way people had imagined, using only the small amount of source material that they had on that subject so far. But in an array of perfect colonial ship designs, the Adamant is the best. I never get tired of seeing this ship in action on screen, and I hope every future iteration of the Deadlock series, if more of them come out, heavily features this ship, because it deserves to be a staple of the Battlestar IP. Huge thanks to Anthony Carriero and the Deadlock team for creating this wonderful, wonderful ship, and I hope you'll all agree with me in its placement at the top of this list. Thank you all for watching. This is Daniel from Spacedock, signing off.
Wasn't that a jolly good show? Now remember, you can head over to the Spacedock Officers Club should you wish to avail yourself of an exclusive Spacedock patch by pledging at the level of Gravimetric Space Gentleman. But you've only got until the 17th of July, so make all haste to the link in the description if you're interested. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.